fees of any organisation. I'm not saying that because I'm competing with Fairtrade, because Fairtrade is fantastic as well. You should be doing both. And that's just where we're at. We've got 57 manufacturers accredited in Australia, 143 retailers signed up, over 570 suppliers have been have gone through the process of being accredited, or at least, you know, we know that they're up to the standard of ECA. There's been over 5,000 home workers have been informed or contacted of their rights and obligations. And that's it, really. So thank you.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Michele. Yeah, I'm from Fairtrade. I guess I'll give a quick overview of Fairtrade in general and what we're trying to do, but then talk about it specifically for cotton. When we talk about Fairtrade in a very general sense, we're talking about a movement that starts with growers and workers in the developing world and kind of moves all the way through to consumers and people who are using the end products here in the developed world. The Fairtrade movement comes together around a shared, I guess, acknowledgement that the globalisation, global economic interdependence, global trade, global commerce and its increases, while it has actually raised quite a lot of people up out of poverty, at the same time it has actually left a lot of people behind, and in some cases actually marginalising a lot of communities further. So as part of that movement, the Fairtrade label is essentially, like ECA, a non-profit accreditation system. We're actually part of a global network of non-profit accreditation systems. And what we're looking at doing is certifying products against the Fairtrade standards. And the Fairtrade standards specifically refer to that transaction that happens for agricultural commodities for the most part. And it's about that transaction between the grower and the trader in the developing world. If you look at supply chains, things like TCF supply chains, that sort of thing, they are quite long and complicated. You do have issues with sweatshops and workers' rights and that sort of thing. And that kind of, I guess, in some cases, a bit of a race to the bottom. And if you think about it in that context, if you take it to its furthest extreme, and that is where the cotton is grown, then you're getting a situation where if there's anyone getting squeezed really hard, it's often the cotton growers. In the context of cotton, we also have, there's a whole bunch of unfair trade rules and a lot of other mitigating circumstances that has meant that millions and millions of people, individuals who are relying on cotton farming within their communities are actually exposed to quite unfair and quite devastating trading relationships where they're forced to essentially sell their cotton at prices that are less than what it actually costs them to grow it. So with Fairtrade, what we're actually doing is certifying that transaction. And the first place that kind of underpins that certification is we're certifying that the growers actually receive a fair price for their cotton, that the price they get for the cotton actually covers what it costs for them to grow the cotton in the first place. And when we're thinking about that cost, we're actually thinking about a sustainable cost. And when you think about a sustainable cost, you're actually thinking about something that's going to sustain their livelihoods into the future. So not just covering their basic inputs, but covering their ability to send their children to school, covering their ability to invest in their next harvest, and all these sort of things that we would expect someone who has toiled quite hard would get for their labour. The other thing with Fairtrade is that with the Fairtrade transaction, there's actually a Fairtrade premium. I guess this is where Fairtrade kind of steps it up a little bit beyond just looking at ethical aspects of the transaction and actually looking at community development and partnership. So the Fairtrade premium actually goes into community investment. Things like schools, education. In the case of cotton, for example, in India, a lot of Indian Fairtrade cotton growers there have actually invested the premium into gaining organic certification. In places like West Africa, they've actually invested the premium into schools, buying tractors, all sorts of things. The essential thing there, though, is that it's the farmers who are deciding what they get to spend that premium on. And so the other key thing that we're looking at with Fairtrade is that it's about empowering those communities and empowering those farmers to actually take control of their own socio-economic futures, to be able to decide what's best for them, to decide whether they're going to invest in their communities, invest in their own businesses and these sort of things. And so when we talk about, you can all see the little label on the jacket there. So if you see products with the Fairtrade cotton label, it's on this shirt, trust me. My chair is slowly swinging around. So essentially what that means is that the cotton growers have actually received a fair go. Having said that, we've actually got a long way to go with Fairtrade cotton. one of the great things where I believe that Fairtrade cotton can actually make a great investment and actually make quite a big change in the TCF industry is if you look at things like cocoa and coffee, where Fairtrade is actually starting to, and ethical certification in general is actually making quite big strides. There is an ethical and sustainable underpinning to a lot of the big business case for that, but there's also a really strong supply chain and business case for it, and that is large businesses are actually starting to recognise that volatile market prices, this kind of shifting commodity prices that are essentially nothing to do with the growers and all to do with speculators in places like New York, human lives. What they're actually recognising now in cocoa and coffee is that they need to invest in these communities. They actually need to invest in the farmers and not just trade with the farmers, but actually partner with the farmers in order to sustain long-term growth, long-term production, and to actually have just reliable quality supply of these products. So one of the key things with Fairtrade and potential with Fairtrade cotton, with cotton you are dealing with quite a volatile price at the moment. It has jumped up quite significantly in the last 12 months. And looking down the track, at some point it will most likely drop again. This isn't a sustainable way to trade with farmers. This isn't a sustainable way to shore up your supply chain as a manufacturer, to be able to look at your supply for the next season or the next harvest. You need to know that you have someone on the ground who is partnering with you, and they need to know that you're actually investing in them in a long-term relationship. So one of the things about Fairtrade, I'll just say, is that it's about going past the transaction and about actual partnerships and positive win-win relationships in the supply chain. That's Fairtrade.
From you.
Thank you very much, Michelle and everyone. It's good to be here. I feel, to be honest, a little vulnerable given the foregoing comments around the injustices in the international trade world, given that I was a trade negotiator for the federal government, but hopefully I can find a way to sort of sneak out past you all. I guess in truth, having been exposed to the world of international trade and having negotiated trade agreements with our Asian neighbours on a frequent basis, it did highlight to me the fact that there were imbalances, and there were areas where commercial entities, private entities, could make a greater difference than governments could. So, in fact, while in government, I was responsible for the government's policy on trade and labour and trade and environment. So, for example, when in trade agreements we open our markets up to China, Korea, Japan, India, we actually try to negotiate standards on the whole. We try to negotiate standards that ensure that our counterparties, India or China in that case, will enforce basic ILO standards among their industry. Now, that's a very difficult thing to do, as many of you in the game will know. So I kind of quickly came to the conclusion that the best way to effect change in the world, and I wouldn't call myself an ethical crusader, but from a commercial perspective, is to follow the money. And that means looking at companies that buy, commission, design, and engage supply chains, particularly offshore deep into Asia. So that led to, I guess, the birth of Tradeworthy. Painful birth it was. And basically, I guess, you'd boil down Tradeworthy to the fact that we work with large consumer-facing organisations who have a reason or a need to examine their supply chain practices. So what we do is basically we assess, we design and we build responsible supply chain approaches after carefully documenting the business drivers behind those approaches. And I'll go through some of the motivations for companies to take up an ethical supply chain approach that we've seen and many others in the panel have different views and experiences. I guess the most prominent is managing risks. So reputational risks, in particular, we saw some of those in the first presentation around, are we good corporate citizens? And the deeper into Asia you go, the more that kind of question comes into focus. Another one is brand differentiation. Companies will often approach us and say, we want to start a new line that is a ethically produced product, and we want to just stick that side by side with our other products. So that sort of brand differentiation, premium products approach. Another one that surprised me quite early on was the company turned around and said, look, we are interested in responsible supply chain approaches, and we're doing it because we've got a fairly young, well-educated workforce in our national chain of retail stores, and they think this is important, so we're doing it for them. We want to show them that we're a good employer of choice. I think it was touched on earlier as well. Another one that's increasing in prominence is in investor relationships. So there is an explosion globally of investor, what they call responsible investment approaches, the so-called ESG, environmental, social and governance approach to investment, which says large pension funds and big amounts of money floating around the world looking for a home, they start examining the bona fides from an ethical perspective of the company they're investing in. So companies that may be looking to attract investment, whether it's the small, medium or very large international corporate end, may be looking at the, shoring up these issues of their company to make themselves more attractive. And lastly, and I guess most importantly, is the doing the right thing approach. Companies do sometimes turn around and say, we want to build ourselves or transform ourselves into a company that does the right thing because we think that's good business. That's an interesting approach, and sometimes there are motivations behind that that are important to dig out. So I guess the common theme amongst our TCF clients, the common driver, most common driver is in fact reputational risk, the one I mentioned first off. And I want to talk about those reputational risks from a social perspective in particular, but I wanted to mention, again, that most of our clients tend to have deep supply chains offshore into Asia. In fact, you could probably generalise that China provides between 80 and 90% of their totally sourced product, which won't surprise many of the people sitting around this room. But this is becoming a riskier business for a few factors. Probably most importantly is the commercial pressures in sourcing from China are changing. We'd all be aware of rising input prices, cotton prices, but also prices in labour prices, particularly in southern China. And uniquely to Australian businesses is the inability to demand a commercial leverage. So, Australians are typically buying at the lower end of the quantum that we see from typically Middle Eastern or Russian or US or EU or increasingly domestic demand in China. In other words, as one client said to me a while back, we're trying to get our suppliers to make us the Monday morning run, and we're typically Thursday afternoon. In other words, we can't demand the same amount of attention given that our quantities are simply smaller. So China is getting tougher. It's a riskier proposition. And at the same time, the environmental, social and governance risks are heightening as people then move into Southeast Asia, so Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, and also into Western China following government incentives. There's also strong NGO and now government focus on supply chains. A good example of this is the California Transparency in Supply Chain Act, which comes into force 1 January 2012. Very briefly, it's going to oblige all companies doing business in California, which is undefined, that have over $100 million in global revenues. So that would take in quite a few, in fact, Australian companies with significant presences in California, that they must disclose efforts they're taking to eradicate human slavery and human trafficking in their supply chains. Huge fines and the obvious reputational risks along with non-compliance. So that's a growing issue, the government focus in this space. And for us, we notice a very huge spike in interest for our services following the live cattle issue. So live cattle seems like a strange thing in terms of the supply chain, but actually it is a supply chain issue. In fact, it's an ethical supply chain issue. It's about the consumption or disposal side of the supply chain, the end of the life of the supply chain, and how the suppliers had set up their governance relationships at the end of life, so to speak. And the fact that that led to an overnight cessation of a $400 million industry involving 10,000 workers really focused the minds of a lot of companies around what ethical supply chain governance really means. So a case study of a typical client is a large consumer-facing apparel retailer, particularly if they have an increasing focus on what they call exclusive brand portfolios. That's products that they're designing in-house to be made specifically and solely for their own retailing purposes. We start by setting out why ethical procurement is important for the business. So we want to document why is the business behind, why will the business fall behind an ethical supply chain approach. And then we move to actually assess and map out their environmental, social and governance risks across their supply chain. And once we've done that, we try to design an appropriate policy and then a rolling out campaign in terms of engaging suppliers. As many people would have heard of the social audit scene, and we've touched on it in terms of ECA's work in Australia. I think it's an $80 billion industry, particularly around China. It's a huge industry with large global players going into factories on a day in, day out, consistent basis and touring factories to assess whether there are fire exits and potable water and important things as well. But there are significant issues which I'm happy to go into later on when we have a question and answer session. So we try and take a bit more of an in-depth approach to try and address the issues embedded in supply chains rather than just wrap them over the knuckles when they don't comply. Maybe in the question and answer session I'll talk about eco and fair trade schemes and why they are critical, but why businesses are having increasing difficulty navigating that space and determining what's right for them. I'll just finish on one note around Australian manufacturing and our strong view that the business case for coming back onshore is slowly taking shape, and we see the potential for a window for attracting onshore manufacturing or a resurgence within the next 6 to 18 months. Some of you may be interested in a recent Boston consulting study which showed that there are 3 states in the US, the south of the US, not South America, the south of the United States of America, where by 2015 there will be comparable labour prices to 3 eastern seaboard cities in China. And that's focusing a lot of people's minds around, hey, if we could do it here cheaper or as cheaply, why are we focusing offshore? So I think there's a similar case study for examining, or a similar business case for studying the Australian scene. But the industry needs a pull factor, and we think the trade-worthy that responsible procurement may be one of those pull factors.
And comments. I also just want to quickly say that Lara and the team that put this together are really on the money in terms of how topical this is. And just in preparation for today, I had a quick look at the fashion source about what some of the stories just in the last week that crossed over this area were, and 4 of them jumped out at me, and all you need to hear is the headlines, really. One was consumers willing to pay more for sustainable apparel if business is transparent, which is about a study that's just been released from the University of Missouri, talking about consumers being prepared to pay 15 to 20% more for products that they believe and that they can show are actually more sustainable in terms of their labour and environmental processes. Then there was one called Melbourne Labels Choosing Local Manufacturing, just picking up on Danny's last point there. Then there was a headline called Zara Implicated in Slave Labour Scandal, just a bit topical in terms of a recent arrival on the Australian scene. And then the last one was about Versace announcing an ending to sandblasting in their supply chain. So just in the last few days, those 4 stories appeared. So obviously topical and a lot of issues to cover. So I welcome anyone who'd like to start our discussion with either a question or a comment.
I just want to ask, for someone who might be operating in this space, what is a good way to start looking at these issues? So if this is something that's kind of just popped up on your radar, you might be operating in and out of China or other countries, possibly out of Asia, what's a good way to start looking at these things? Do you go direct to your suppliers? Do you get an independent body to come and have a look at your supply chain?
Simon wants to start.
Well, certainly if you're doing any manufacturing in Australia, you can come and talk to us about what you can do about making sure your supply chain's ethical, and also about promoting your supply chain, in terms of your ethical practices. It's about that relationship building, about knowing what's going on in your supply chain, having control over it and doing the right thing. And customers are being much more, they're much more informed through the internet and through generally about what's going on. They can ask more questions, and it's about you delivering on that. And certainly in terms of on the local side, would strongly advise people, if they wanted to do the right thing, to come and talk to ECA, and obviously Fairtrade if they're doing stuff as well.
One of the things I would say too is definitely start just asking the question. At Fairtrade, we have some partnerships and relationships with other NGOs who are often campaigning around slave labour. People like World Vision and that sort of thing, and they'll do letter writing campaigns to some large businesses, and it's always very, very interesting to hear their response that comes back to these letter writing campaigns. And they'll often talk to people, and a supply manager or a buyer will often say, well, I haven't actually asked that question myself yet. And they'll ask someone within their firm, and they're like, oh, good question. So just starting that chain of questions, I think, is a really good place to start. And looking on the labour work with the Uzbekistan cotton issue, there's Stop the Traffic currently has a letter writing campaign around that, and just asking the question, can you guarantee us that cotton is not coming from Uzbekistan? And there's companies who go, well, no, we can't. And, or the very, very loud no comment that often comes from companies as well.
I guess I would say two things, and they're both equally as important in terms of first steps. One is, as a business, as an organisation, as a sole producer of fashion, sit down and try to map out your supply chain. I know that sounds like I get my stuff made there, but I think if you dig a little deeper, and I'm talking about going to the point where raw materials enter the chain. If you can do that, you're already half the way. You understand where your product and where the products are coming from. And at the same time, for, I guess, medium to larger businesses, you need to build the business case for having an approach on ethical procurement. And why that's important is because it all comes down to budget, ultimately. Companies in this very difficult retail environment are all struggling to make ends meet to get stock on shelves. But if you can build a strong business case around why this is important for the company, what do our consumers think, what do our investors think, what do we think as a business, where do we want to be and position ourselves, and if you can do that and then start work on mapping out your supply chain, I think you're already going to make the business case so strong and irresistible that you'll start taking action in these areas.
Thanks. And just on that last point, we had a we had a recent example of working with a company who they were manufacturing mainly in Australia, and they thought there was about 150 people involved in their supply chain actually making their garments. But once they started going through a process with the union and ECA, they ended up at last count discovering there was 450 people involved in making their products. And this was a large company here, operating both in the manufacturing and the retail space. And so that point of understanding your own supply chain, I think, is so critical to beginning the issue of actually then dealing with what might be happening within it. And it's amazing how many people don't know who's in their own supply chain. Okay.
I'm starting out and I'm looking for manufacturing in Australia. So if I go to ethical clothing, can you connect, or are you an after the event accredited service? Well, so do you link?
Oh yeah. Yeah. Hello. Oh, hi. Yeah, I mean, we can help. I mean, part of our job is to obviously help you get through and become accredited, but we're connected with a lot of accredited brands and people like that, and we work closely with organisations like the TCFUA, so certainly we can help you in terms of getting access to those businesses and being able to talk to them, because there's an amazing amount of organisations, manufacturers, retailers who are involved in ethical clothing and getting into that space. And I think it's, for me, coming back from the UK and coming to Australia, it's quite amazing what's going on in this country in terms of textile clothing and footwear manufacturing and design. And, you know, we're doing some great stuff here, and we've got to get out there and tell people about it. We've got to make sure that we're doing the right things. We can't go out there and tell people how great we are if we haven't got our own house in order. So I think that, yeah, look, there's lots of opportunity, and I'd welcome it if you want to come and catch up. It'd be fine.
And companies that get accredited with their supply chain, one of the things they're asked is whether the suppliers are happy to have their details passed on to other people. So where that's the case, there's no problem in passing on those suppliers.
I just wanted to ask, with supply chain from Asia, whether you run up against a lot of resistance because of Chinese regulations being quite tough, whether there's any resistance to opening themselves up, I guess, to suggestions to participate in these programs.
So just to so I understand the question, you're saying, do we run up against issues in terms of on-the-ground regulation by Chinese authorities when we're trying to, I guess, shed light on practices? That's the question. As I said, the social audit industry is an $80 billion with a B, billion-dollar industry. It's now well-grounded around the world, but particularly so in China. In fact, it's quite a sector for commerce and, you know, attracting funds and investment. The organisations that tend to operate in China tend to be global, so they're based perhaps in Europe. So already there's a suggestion that they have a license to operate within China. One must get a license to operate a service like that. But I would also say that the way that the social audit industry is going, and this is probably the prime tool for exposing light on what's going on in the typical sort of sweatshop scenario. I guess there are significant flaws in the social audit industry that mean that if there were people that wanted to hide practices that were going on, in other words, within government circles within China or other places, they wouldn't mind the continuation of the way the social audit industry is going. I'm trying to be quite political in the way I'm answering it. But look, on the whole, China, in my experience as a trade negotiator, wants to open up its markets to the world in a genuine sense, both import and export. They genuinely want to be a world player. They've joined the World Trade Organization, for example, which entailed a significant raft of new constraints on the way they run their industry. So I wouldn't say that they're an authoritarian regime that wants to close their factories behind murky walls. The opposite. I think they are genuinely trying to move in a value-add direction that we're all trying to move in our economies. And so I think the signs are hopeful. Put that answer.
When you think of the size of that auditing industry, what creates one with integrity and a genuine one is a huge question in this issue. So how do you determine whether it's an accreditation scheme that in itself has integrity and that is rigorous, is something that I think is hotly debated around the world at the moment. And one of the key aspects of it, I think, is it being a multi-stakeholder. I hate that terminology, but not just something that is a business operation, that actually involves a number of stakeholders in terms of businesses, government, unions in it. I think that's a key component of whether it's likely to have more integrity from my perspective.
Yeah, but my question is around, I guess, the number of different certificates does what, and from the industry's perspective, where do I turn and how are these things structured? Are some subsets of others? Where do I start, if you like?
Attention visitors, commencing in 2 minutes is the next
I think we're definitely starting to reach a point globally and maybe to a slightly lesser extent in Australia where it's no longer good enough for a consumer just to go, oh well, it's independently verified. We need to educate consumers about the kind of questions they need to ask of certification. So they know how to differentiate between a really strong one and one that's essentially not doing a great deal at the other end of the spectrum. The good thing though, it does, from a market point of view and from a consumer point of view, and even I guess from a business point of view, there can be this kind of great plethora of brand labels that are there, and it's easy to get confused. But the positive is that on the ground, where the actual change is happening and where these certification systems are certifying changes and the kind of standards they're looking for, there is a lot of collaboration, thankfully, in that space. So while at the market and here, in coffee and cocoa and other things, it might seem like we are competing directly with these other labels. We are, but on the ground, we're actually collaborating really strongly. The core thing, first and foremost, I think, is that yes, we do need to remove some confusion for consumers. We need to remove confusion for businesses. But first, we need to remove the confusion and burden on the factories and the farmers and these guys, and make sure that this space of multiple brands and labels isn't a burden on them. And then when we can really get that, I think then we can move along to a system where consumers can know very well what to ask about a label. So I think at the moment, thankfully we have the internet. We have the consumer is a much better place to do this research. But in terms of making sure that the space doesn't get crowded by yet another fair label or yet another eco or green label, is quite difficult. And in places like, I think China's a really good example, and manufacturing is a good example where Fairtrade right now, we're doing a textiles project globally where we are looking to expand beyond just working with farmers and actually seeing what we can do in the manufacturing space and textile supply chains. But a core part of that is to make sure that we're actually, when we do get there, we're actually adding something to the industry, that we're not just duplicating what other people are doing. And so again, I think the often used word, like Michele said, the multi-stakeholder approach, is really, I keep turning around, is really important at that end. And hopefully it won't get to a point where, you've just got labels all over the product and the actual brand's not there anymore. But yeah, we've got a little way to go, I think, in terms of making that more clear.
Give a plug for Ethical Clothing Australia, but I think you're right. There is a lot of confusion. I think, Daniel's right about you've got to look at some key things. And what does that supply chain do? I mean, Ethical Clothing Australia is, I think, one of the only few Australian-based sort of labels that deals specifically with working practices and the treatment of workers and stuff, which is critical. And so, for us, we can use that as a selling point, but there's some really key elements you've got to look at in certification schemes. One is transparency. Are they going to be honest about where they make things? Two, how are they verifying what they're saying? Are they involving workers and trade unions in the verification process? Because I've worked on various ethical codes of conduct across the world, and one of the biggest flaws is that there's a lot of reliance on social audits, and there's real issues around social audits and their independence and whether they really get to the nut of what's going on. So you've got to make sure you're asking some of those key questions when you're looking at a scheme. How open it is, how is the actual thing verified, are they responding to those issues, how are they managing their supply chain. And the thing is, in the world we're in now, everyone's got access to information they never had before. It's very easy to get caught up if you don't do the right thing. So, that's what I would say.
Just a short comment, if you allow me to be pretty frank. Given our commercial experience at Tradeworthy, frankly, one of the reasons that we're in business is to navigate the way around and through the forest of logos. One client called it logo wars. There was a recent move. I do a bit of work in the food and grocery industry, and as well be aware, the Australian Packaging Covenant requires essentially companies to reduce the size of their packaging, but at the same time they were being asked to put more logos on, and they weren't quite sure whether it was better to have bigger packaging with more logos that showed more compliance or less. And so that led to the term logo wars. But to be fair, the way we advise companies, and this is one of our key services, is to actually say, look, what makes sense for your stakeholders? What makes sense for the line of it, the area that you're working in, the industry? And essentially a kind of cost-benefit analysis of, before you get into bed with a particular brand or label or whatever, or scheme, you've got to know where they play in the world and what their philosophical underpinning is. A very good example outside of the TCF sector is forest products. So there's the global scheme, the FSC, Forest Stewardship Council, and the PEFC, or PFC. These guys are two global organisations based in Europe that essentially run relatively comparable schemes for certification of forest products, sustainable forestry. And they recently had a very public falling out and spat, to the point where now they do not recognise each other's assessments, even though they're factually covering fairly similar ground. Now, what if you as a business had put all of your stock in the FSC, and then, it's sort of like VHS and Beta, which one's going to win? And I don't think companies should have to face that question. So, critical, but very difficult to navigate.
And interestingly, that article that I referred to earlier about the University of Missouri, one of the key things they said was that it's not just that consumers are willing to pay more, but also where businesses are able to prove the claims. So one of the things they were highlighting in that study was it's not enough just to make the claim. So there has to be enough of a confidence from the consumer's point of view that the labelling or the accreditation scheme is actually genuine and that it's not just a sort of company marketing exercise. Otherwise it doesn't work. Danny, go ahead.
I touched on this earlier on in the presentation. I guess risk mitigation in the TCF sector is probably the key motivating factor. There's been recent campaigns by Get Up and against some of the leading furniture brands. People don't want to see the names in the wrong headlines. I had one client that actually said to me, we're getting 5 calls a day from people in our stores saying, I'm going to walk out of this store and not buy your sofa if you can't prove ABC, which really actually meant something to people who care about the companies and are involved in it. They're not just bean counting, penny pinching, corporate organisations. They actually care about their brand and the brand positioning. So risk mitigation still probably is the key first single biggest motivating factor. But as I said, a client quite early on was very frank and said, look, we've got a young, youthful, well-educated workforce. We want them to like the company they work in, and this is important to them. So employee value proposition is another one. And I'll just finish with investor relations, particularly at the larger end, this is a really important area of understanding. Global pension funds, really the keys to the global economy in many ways. This is aggregating all of our superannuation funds in the world. These guys are increasingly looking at ways that they can responsibly, so-called, invest their funds in entities that won't turn around with reputational risks and won't essentially lead to a chipping away of their purchase price over the medium to long term. So companies are saying we want to act ethically because we want to attract more investment.
Yeah, and my experience is that it really varies. Like for some companies, they start off with, I want to create an ethical company. I want to create, I want to operate in this space. That's what I'm going to create. And from word go, I'm going to make sure that that's the sort of business and the supply chain I have. Others, it's a catastrophe. Suddenly, they are making products in a factory in Bangladesh which burns down and people are killed, which happens just a few months ago with 27 workers dying in a clothing factory in Bangladesh. And of course, for the people who are making that factory, globally, there's an immediate catastrophe that they have to deal with. For others, it's something in between those two things, and it's worrying about risk, worrying about, is something bad going to happen? I better start to pay attention to this, and increasingly that is something that more and more businesses are thinking about, well, how can I be in front of this instead of reactive to it? And in others, they get caught up in a consumer campaign, and before they know it, they're being targeted in terms of activists or consumers who are saying, is your brand ethical? And so then again, the companies are responding to it. So it's a whole range of motivating forces, right from at one end, people who are genuinely approaching it from, I want to make sure everything's okay and it's a good thing for business to do it, right through to people who end up in a really bad situation and have to play catch up to try and salvage their brand and their company in some cases that may not survive the risk.
Just to add to that, as well, with the earlier comments about the investment community, particularly in the bigger brands, and I know when I was working in the UK, there was a number of shareholder resolutions put before some of the big retailers about the way they treated their workers, and there was a lot of support in the investment community, but the biggest driver for ethical clothing would be procurement. Government procurement is a big driver. The government can play a real leadership role. They're a big buyer of goods. And obviously the other side is just wanting to do the right thing. So basically wanting to make sure that you're doing the right thing, which then has benefits for your business in terms of lower, you don't get into trouble, obviously, and a whole range of other issues. But yeah, there's a government leadership role that needs to be played in terms of setting a direction for where the textile clothing and footwear industry needs to go, but also just being more aware of what your customers want.
Just to add to that, I think all of the above, definitely, but also I'm quite lucky working in Fairtrade Cotton, and some of the businesses, particularly the ones here in Victoria that I get to work with, like Three Fish and Edico, who made this T-shirt. Some of those people just love a challenge as well. They want to prove that you can do this. They want to prove to other people who've said, oh no, it's only a fad. It's only it only works so far, and people. You won't be able to make lots of money out of it. These are the kind of people who just love to prove people wrong as well. They love a challenge as well. So I think that's also a big part of it.
Because obviously the prices have to drop. So what happens to the living standard of those people?
Look, it's a good question. I don't stand, it's not my analysis, so I can't give you the full factors. But I will say, from going back to my sort of trade negotiating days, there's an economic cycle. And we know this well in Australia. If a particular industry sector gets left to waste over a number of years, when people start regenerating when the cycle comes back, they've learned a lot of lessons and they can be perhaps more productive. But I won't say that there aren't any questions around low pay and low wages. America has a very significant problem with non-unionised workforce and therefore sort of non-compliance. So it's typically those areas we're looking at where they have these low production costs. So I would argue two things. America's learnt lessons of its past, its recent past, and second, so it's regenerating. And secondly, there probably is question around the governance around that production base as well.
I just add to that I would, not an expert on this, but I would hazard a guess that part of the fact that they are becoming more comparable would also be because of the growing cost of Chinese labour as well, and the growth in minimum wage there, to a degree.
Not there yet. No.
Yeah. My question is, or how would, is there any kind of measures that may be taken since similar ethical problems might arise in these countries as well?
It's a very good question. My answer might surprise you. I actually don't see it as a problem. I don't see moving production from one country to the next to follow a lower production cost base as a problem. I see it as a natural economic cycle, but you need to do it in the right way. So the challenges are moving not just out of China, but from China and eastern seaboard to Western China, where governments are providing, the Chinese government is providing greater and bigger incentives to move into Western China, but also into Southeast Asia. We recently concluded, as Australia, a trade agreement with the ASEAN nations, so Thailand, Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam and others. And that has created an incentive for Australian companies to look at sourcing from those countries. So the economic case stacks up. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I just think from the ethical perspective, it raises new challenges. So China has been probably the biggest recipient or the biggest frontier for this $80 billion social auditing industry. Very little happens in Southeast Asia. And we even know that the social auditing industry has problems. So in other words, there's a long way to go. So when I advise clients to adopt what I call a China plus one strategy, which is if you're currently 80% plus reliant for sourcing product in China and you want to start experimenting with diversifying your supplier base, I'm always talking about the unique challenges in Indonesia or in Vietnam or in Thailand or in the Philippines. And you'll be happy about this, I always throw in the option of looking closer to home.
My recent experience in terms of the international textile, garment and leather workers in Southeast Asia is that there's been some studies done looking at what is a living wage in those countries, and there's a large growth of clothing production, for example, in Cambodia, in Bangladesh, as I mentioned, and it's a lot cheaper to manufacture in those countries at the moment than it is in China. But correspondingly, if you look at the actual rates of pay, and then we'll look at what is needed for an individual or a family to meet basic subsistence survival in terms of food, shelter, water, getting to work and educating their family, the wages that are being paid are not meeting that level. So I think there's obviously issues about moving to lower wage countries as a strategy. If you have an overview of wanting to have an ethical supply chain, I think it is a very complex and difficult thing once you're in countries where the monitoring of those standards becomes more and more difficult. Good question. And I think a number of the people here actually are. So, and interestingly, we were talking about this earlier, there has been some recent moves by companies that have decided to move their production source back to Australia after having manufactured in China or other parts of Asia. And there's been a combination of things that those companies have been talking about. They've been talking about rising costs, and so this question about whether it is actually that much cheaper. But more importantly, they've been talking about issues to do with responsiveness to market, supply, quick changing fashion, and the capacity to respond quickly to the demands of consumers, and all of those lending themselves to having a local and flexible supply base that you actually can be in front of the game if you've got a local supply, as opposed to some of the problems with being, as we were discussing earlier, low down on the list of a factory in China which might be making for a large UK or European market and then gets to the Australian order on the Thursday. So not enough from my perspective, but I think we are actually seeing some people decide to stay here or come back here in response to both the ethical issues but also the supply issues. Other questions or comments?
Just a question for Simon. I've got an Australian factory that I'm commencing production in maybe 3 or 4 weeks' time. I've only visited them a couple of times. Just wondering, next time I go out there, what are some basic things I can perhaps look for or ask the manufacturer to give me a bit of an idea?
Well, good luck anyway with the venture, but you're saying that you're in the process of approaching people about producing clothes and stuff like that for you? And you want to sort of go down the sort of ethical route and stuff like that. I mean, my obvious question would be to just talk to our accreditation advisor about some of those questions you need to ask, you know. for your particular needs. So and give you sort of an idea of like what are the things that you're looking for, and you know we can give you some feedback on that. So.
Communicate with your guys initially. Some of the manufacturers that were recommended just weren't willing to take me on because I am so small.
Oh, okay.
Being first production, it's quite hard really to convince someone to take you on in the first place. So I want to make sure at least the factory that I've chosen for this first run to get established that they are going to be doing the right thing.
Are they accredited manufacturer?
No, they're not accredited.
Okay.
No.
We'll come back. Talk to me afterwards. We'll follow it up. Okay.
They're faring very, very well. We had about 200% retail sales growth in 2010. About 50-odd% before that, and 80% before that, and that's in the context of a global financial crisis and a bunch of other kind of economic challenges. So, for the most part, it is very positive. Like the article that Michele highlighted, consumers are looking for these sort of things. There's a professor in Harvard, Michael Hiscox, who's done some really interesting studies on the effect of the label on the consumer and done some sort of clinical trials in supermarkets and on eBay. And they're seeing sort of 15 to 20% growth, and also that 15-20% premium that people are willing to pay. Having said that, on the Fairtrade cotton side, globally, that is probably the one that's challenging us the most. Because, like I mentioned before, we are working in global commodities. We're dealing with agricultural commodities. The coffee or tea supply chain compared to a cotton supply chain is very, very different. And so we're currently now, we've had the cotton model for over 5 years. We're actually internationally looking at it again to see how we can change that a little bit to get a better pull factor on the market end, and to make the Fairtrade model a little bit more I guess relevant to the TCF model. There's a little way to go to that, but having said that, the Fairtrade.
I think we're getting a little bit of a wrap up here. If there's any last questions or comments, I'm happy to take them.
I just wanted to come back to the conversation you had about the proliferation of eco-labels. I think from my analysis, I work in this space along with these guys up here. I think the problem that we've got today is that there is too many shit eco-labels. And I think Daniel's point about trying to get through to which ones are credible, and I think, just to quote, kind of channel Julie Gillard with her "don't write crap," I think we have a responsibility as businesses not to use crap labels. We actually need to invest in those ones that are credible, that are transparent, have multi-stakeholder governance, all those things. It's very easy to get sucked into the cheap ones that don't really add any value, and then we contribute to consumer confusion from that. So that's one thing I would say is, look, there's some really good analysis out there now if you do spend some time looking at articles and research around which are credible labels, and there's really great organisations like the iSteel Alliance that are, give codes of conduct for how standards are set, how they're monitored, and how that they prove that they have impact. And I think that's the fundamental thing we need to come back to with any of these labelling systems or responsible supply chain things is, well, what are you actually trying to achieve? We are trying to achieve an outcome here that means it's better, our supply chains are better for people and planet, and that's how we need to judge them. If we can demonstrate that it's having that, that's independently verified that we're having impact through the choices we make in our supply chain, that's the ultimate test. And I think if you draw that line through a lot of the eco-labels we're talking about, very quickly you won't find very many that are stacking up. And I think we have a responsibility in the business, and there are businesses around like Tradeworthy and Net Balance and others now that can help people navigate through those things. But certainly a lot of free resources on the web to search to find out, well, which labels are credible, which things are important to me as a business. And I think we have a responsibility not to contribute to there being more noise in the marketplace by choosing labels that don't mean anything.
I think that's a pretty good way to wrap us up for today. I want to firstly start by thanking our three speakers who did the boy band beautifully with the noise in the background. They managed to get over that and not break into dance, which might have been entertaining, but wasn't what we were asking them to do today. They did a fantastic job getting across to you the details of what's involved in Ethical Clothing Australia, in Fairtrade, and also in Tradeworthy. So please join with me in thanking Simon McRae, Daniel Daniel Mackay and Danny Burrows. Thanks very much. And I also want to thank the TFIA and Lara McPherson and Eloise Bishop in particular, who helped put all of this together and did a great job introducing these subjects to you today. And thanks so much for participating. They were great questions, and I'm sure if there's any others or any issues you want to follow up with, we'll all be around for a few moments. Thanks very much.
When I started, I think we had about 4 or 5 licensees who are licensed to use the label here in Australia. Now we're hitting about 10 or 12, so it is constantly growing, and my inbox is constantly filling up with people, particularly small designers who are really interested in using fair trade cotton. So it's good, and they are getting significant market benefits out of it. Three Fish and Edico, they've both won sustainability awards here in Victoria and a bunch of things, and they're getting great kudos for their work, as well as the fact that they are certified with the product. Reached a tipping point for these companies yet either.